I want you to picture, if you will, a boundless, pitch-black canvas of a violently raging ocean. Seriously, close your eyes and just imagine towering mountains of water. They are cold, they are unforgiving, and they are rising up out of the sheer darkness with one single terrifying purpose: to utterly crush anything made of wood and iron that dares to cross their path. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today we are diving deep into what has to be one of the most intense, visually stunning, and cinematic survival narratives ever recorded in all of ancient history. We are talking about a story found in the 27th chapter of the book of Acts. But listen, as we unpack the historical layers and the sheer dramatic weight of our sources today, you're going to see very quickly that this is far, far more than just some dusty, forgotten nautical log. What we are looking at is a titanic, epic clash between human arrogance and the uncontrollable, raw fury of nature. It's a story about exactly what happens when our worldly expertise absolutely shatters and we are forced against our will to confront the ultimate limits of human power. So, take a deep breath, steady your nerves, and let's step together onto the creaking, saltwater-soaked wooden deck of an ancient Alexandrian grain ship that is about to sail directly into a living nightmare.
276. I really want you to let the heavy reality of that number sink in for a second. 276 breathing, terrified, desperate human souls. That is the exact number of men trapped inside what is very quickly about to become a violently tossing, floating wooden coffin. Just think about the sheer variety of humanity packed onto this vessel. You got seasoned sailors who have proudly navigated the unpredictable Mediterranean waters for years. You have battle-hardened Roman soldiers marching around with the cold, heavy steel of the empire at their hips. And then, down deep in the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, you have prisoners bound in heavy iron chains. Every single one of these 276 lives is about to be pushed to the absolute razor-thin brink of human endurance. They are sailing straight into a crucible where all of their impressive titles, all of their hoarded wealth, and all of their military weapons are going to mean absolutely nothing.
Act 1. The Ignored Prophetic Warning.
Now, every truly epic tragedy in history always begins with a choice, right? Our narrative opens up in the warm, sunlit port of Fair Havens. It's this moment of beautiful, deceptive calm on the island of Crete. And right here on this sunny dock, we see the ultimate showdown. Professional arrogance standing on one side, and spiritual insight standing on the other. The mighty Roman Empire's military machine is heavily present here, and it's embodied by a centurion named Julius. Julius is a man of absolute, unquestioned authority, tasked with escorting these prisoners all the way to Italy. But among these captives is a man named Paul, a prisoner possessing this incredibly deep, piercing spiritual intuition. Now, the ship's captain and the owner, they're looking nervously at the calendar. They've reached a notoriously dangerous season for sailing. The time of the fastest past, which in the ancient world meant the Mediterranean was rapidly transitioning into its volatile, deadly winter months. But they're also looking at their own personal comfort. Fair Havens just isn't a great, luxurious place to spend the winter. They want to push further down the rugged coast to a better port called Phoenix. So it's a calculation driven completely by convenience and total overconfidence. But standing on the other side of this dangerous equation is Paul, who actually steps forward, chains and all, to issue a dire, unyielding warning.
Listen closely to the heavy, almost cinematic weight of these words. Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Notice how Paul isn't stuttering here. He isn't just making a wild guess. He is speaking with absolute, terrifying clarity. But I want you to imagine the scene on that sun-drenched, creaking deck. Our sources paint this incredibly vivid picture of arrogant smirks slowly crossing the sun-baked faces of the shipmaster and the captain. I mean, you can almost hear them laughing, right? Who is this dusty prisoner in chains trying to tell us how to do our jobs? We've successfully navigated these tricky waters for decades. And Julius, the centurion, the man essentially holding the power of life and death in his hands, makes his fateful choice. He looks at the captain's impressive worldly experience, he glances dismissively at Paul's heavy iron chains, and he chooses to trust the so-called expert. He completely and totally dismisses the spiritual intuition of the captive. And then, almost like a cruel joke, the environment itself actually seems to validate their sheer arrogance. A gentle south wind began to blow. The ancient text notes that when they felt this soft, warm breeze hit their faces, they actually thought they had obtained their purpose. They genuinely thought they had won. It was the ultimate fatal illusion of control. You can vividly picture it, the loud creak of the massive wooden mast, the rhythmic, confident chanting of the sailors as they heave up that heavy iron anchor, their giant sails catching this perfectly warm, gentle breeze. They're smiling, they're relaxed, they're probably patting each other on the back. But a terrifying, monstrous truth is lurking just out of sight, just over the horizon. Because this gentle breeze was nothing more than a deceptive camouflage. It was a perfectly disguised doorway to hell. Simply by trusting in their own logic and chasing their own worldly comfort, they have just unknowingly sealed the horrible fate of all 276 souls on board.
Act 2. Wrath of the Euroclydon.
Okay, so the energy on the ship shifts entirely. And I don't mean over a few hours. I mean in a matter of terrifying heartbeats. That gentle, warm south wind just dies. The sky, which moments ago was a comforting, clear blue, instantly bruises into this violent, churning, apocalyptic purple, and it unleashes a literal monster onto the sea. Euroclydon. It's defined as a violent, tempestuous northeast wind. But listen, the historical sources don't just describe this as a bad storm. They describe it as a predatory beast, literally pouncing down from the towering mountains of the island of Crete. It doesn't just blow against the ship, it violently grabs the massive Alexandrian vessel in its jaws. The sheer, brute, explosive force of this initial impact is so completely overwhelming that the helmsman, the very expert who was so smugly confident just a few hours before, is physically paralyzed. The massive wooden tiller is literally ripped right out of his blistered hands. The ship cannot even be turned to face into the wind. In an instant, they are entirely stripped of their control, forced to just let this gigantic ship drive blindly into a roaring, chaotic abyss.
Let's walk through this agonizing timeline together, step by step, because we really need to understand the sheer physical and psychological torture these men endured. Day 1, they are helplessly driven, completely and utterly at the mercy of the violent waves slamming into the hull. By day 2, the situation has become so incredibly desperate that they actually begin throwing their precious cargo overboard. They are willingly sacrificing their own wealth, throwing fortunes into the sea, just to stay afloat for a few more hours. But listen to day 3. This is the exact moment the true horror sets in. The sailors are casting out the ship's tackle. Think about that. With their own bare, bleeding, blistered hands, these seasoned mariners are tossing their essential sailing gear, their only physical survival tools, straight into the black, churning waves. And then comes the agonizing, soul-crushing stretch all the way to day 14. 14 days of complete sensory deprivation. No warm sun to dry their clothes. No familiar stars to guide them in the night. Ancient navigation relied entirely on reading the heavens, and the heavens had gone completely, terrifyingly dark.
This brings us to a total, systemic collapse of the human spirit. Absolute darkness, extreme physical exhaustion, and finally, the utter death of human hope. The sources we're looking at place massive emphasis on this specific moment. It is the total bankruptcy of human civilization, technology, and expertise. The raging Adriatic Sea has completely broken their spirits. These guys haven't eaten a single meal in 2 full weeks. They are battered, they are freezing to the bone, and they are vomiting in the pitch-black darkness of the ship's belly. The text explicitly states that all hope that they should be saved was utterly lost. Think about the gravity of that. The maritime experts have totally failed. The famed Roman military might is utterly useless against the ocean. The grand ship has become nothing but a splintering, groaning prison. They are literally just sitting there, waiting in the dark for the freezing water to finally swallow them whole.
And it is exactly against this bleak backdrop of absolute suffocating despair that a single figure stands up on the pitch-black, violently pitching deck. It's Paul, the chained prisoner they all laughed at back in the sunlight. But he isn't speaking as a lowly prisoner anymore. Right here, in the middle of a hurricane, he transitions into a radiant, commanding, spiritual leader. Speaking over the deafening, roaring thunder of the storm, he delivers a breathtaking, almost angelic promise. Read this quote with me. "For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." I mean, what an incredible paradox. The very vessel they all thought would be their salvation is doomed to be completely pulverized, but their fragile, mortal lives, every single one of them, will miraculously be spared. In the darkest possible hour of human panic, when all human strength is evaporated, Paul anchors them to a divine promise.
Act 3. Forging a Shared Destiny. We are now entering the 14th night of this endless waking nightmare. Piercing through the impenetrable, freezing darkness and the howling wind, the sailors suddenly hear a sound that absolutely chills them to the bone. The deep, rhythmic, thunderous roar of breakers. Massive, violent waves crashing against solid rock. They realize they're being driven straight toward an unseen, jagged coast in the dead of night. In sheer panic, they drop 4 heavy iron anchors from the stern just to try and slow the ship down. But survival situations often bring out the absolute darkest shadows of human nature. Step 1. The expert sailors, fully realizing the massive ship is doomed, attempt a selfish, cowardly, mutinous escape. They quietly begin lowering the only little lifeboat into the sea under the fake guise of dropping more anchors from the bow, planning to just row away and leave everyone else on board to drown. But then, step 2, Paul sees right through their treachery. He sharply warns the centurion, shouting, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." And then we hit step 3, which is just brilliant, brutal finality. The Roman soldiers draw their heavy iron swords and violently hack through the thick ropes holding the lifeboat. The empty little boat crashes into the freezing waves and just drifts away into the dark, taking their only conventional escape plan with it.
I really want you to think about the profound cinematic symbolism of those severed ropes falling into the sea. This is the ultimate transition from divided panic to a shared fate. By physically cutting away that lifeboat, Paul and the centurion have permanently eliminated any chance of individual selfish salvation. They have essentially forced all 276 souls, the wealthy aristocratic Roman officers, the deceitful hardened sailors, and the chained desperate prisoners, to be inextricably bound together. They are now a single breathing entity. They will either survive the coming dawn together as one unbroken human chain, or they will all sink to the bottom of the Black Sea together. There is no plan B. It is the absolute ultimate commitment to a shared destiny.
And right before the first, faint, gray light of dawn finally begins to break over that violent, churning horizon, something incredibly atmospheric, almost beautifully sacred, takes place on this ruined deck. Paul gathers these 276 starving, trembling, terrified men around him. He powerfully reiterates the divine promise, "Not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And then he calmly takes a simple loaf of bread. Imagine this visual. Right in the middle of a screaming hurricane, standing on a shattered ship that is literally about to be torn to shreds on a reef, he gives thanks to God, calmly breaks the bread, and just begins to eat. The historical sources we're reviewing highlight this as a profoundly priestly act of comfort. It miraculously restores a quiet, grounded peace right in the very eye of the storm. And inspired by his totally serene confidence, the crew finally eats, gaining the crucial physical strength they are going to desperately need for the final, incredibly violent ordeal that is waiting for them in the surf.
Act 4. The final epic collision.
The dawn finally breaks, but the pale morning light reveals a terrifying, adrenaline-pumping reality, an unknown bay with a sandy beach, separated from them by a violently churning, deadly expanse of sea. They have to make their desperate final push. They cut the heavy anchor ropes, letting them fall into the sea. They frantically toss the very last of their valuable wheat cargo into the water to lighten the ship. They hoist the small foresail into the roaring wind, and they ride this massive, groaning wooden missile straight into the teeth of the crashing surf. Now, the sources use a very specific, ominous phrase for what happens next. The ship hits a place where 2 seas meet. This is a cross-current of immense, unbelievably violent hydraulic pressure. The deafening, splintering roar of the shipwreck is pure cinema. The massive wooden bow of the Alexandrian grain ship wedges violently deeply into a submerged, immovable clay reef. It is instantly stuck fast, like a giant spear driven into the dirt. But the back of the ship is still fully exposed to the open, raging ocean. and those towering mountainous waves of the Eurocleidon begin to systematically, relentlessly, and brutally smash the stern to absolute pieces. The massive ship is quite literally exploding into deadly wooden splinters right beneath their feet.
And as the wet wooden deck violently shatters, a new, horrifying level of human darkness suddenly emerges. The Roman soldiers, who know full well that strict Roman military law demands their own brutal execution if even a single prisoner escapes, draw their swords. They quickly hatch a murderous, panicked plot to systematically slaughter every chained captive on board before they can jump into the water and swim away. The cold steel blades are out in the freezing rain. It's about to be a massacre. But Julius, the centurion, screams at the top of his lungs for them to stop. Why? Because of Paul. Julius is absolutely, fiercely desperate to save the man who has completely become their spiritual anchor throughout this nightmare. And simply by stepping in to save Paul, Julius inadvertently extends a massive blanket of immunity over every single captive on the ship. Paul's mere presence alone becomes the impenetrable shield that saves all these men from the edge of the Roman sword.
And then the scene devolves into ultimate, beautiful chaos. Escape into the surging surf. Julius barks the final, desperate order. Those who can actually swim must dive headfirst into the freezing, violently churning foam first. The rest of them, those who cannot swim, those who are just too weak or injured, must grab onto anything they can find. I want you to paint that incredibly vivid picture in your mind's eye. Grown, hardened men clinging desperately to jagged, floating wooden planks, holding on for dear life to the splintered, bobbing wreckage of their once proud, massive ship. They are being brutally tossed, turned, and pulverized by the relentlessly breaking waves, desperately fighting the undertow for every single burning breath of air as the furious sea tries one last time to drag them down into the dark.
Act 5. Redemption on the shores.
And then, slowly, the roaring, deafening chaos of the deep water finally begins to fade. We visually transition from the violent crash of the towering breakers and the terrifying splintering of giant timbers to the quiet, intimate sound of heavy, exhausted, ragged human breathing. One by one, battered, freezing, soaking wet bodies wash up onto the cold, wet sand. They literally have to drag themselves on their hands and knees out of the freezing sea foam, coughing up salt water, collapsing in pure exhaustion onto the solid earth of an island they will soon learn is called Malta. The massive storm is still howling in the distance behind them, but the ground beneath their bruised bodies is finally, beautifully still. And as the dust and the sea spray finally settles, a profound, mathematically impossible number emerges on that beach. 0. Absolutely 0 casualties. Against the incomprehensible, destructive, monstrous might of the Eurocleidon. Against 14 brutal days of starvation and sheer psychological terror. Against the utter, violent destruction and pulverization of a massive wooden cargo ship. And even against the freshly drawn swords of desperate, panicked Roman soldiers. The divine prophecy, delivered by a chained prisoner in the absolute darkest hour of the night, was fulfilled with absolute flawless precision. 0 lives were lost to the deep. 276 men dragged themselves onto that wet, sandy beach, completely unharmed, exactly as it was promised. Just think about the incredible metamorphosis of Paul throughout this journey. He went from being a completely dismissed, mocked, chained prisoner to becoming the undeniable, radiant savior of an entire crew. Human arrogance was completely and totally shattered against the rocks. Every single piece of human technology, every navigational tool, every ounce of hoarded worldly expertise was physically destroyed and left to rot at the bottom of the sea. But because they were forced to trust in an ultimate unshakable spiritual anchor, because they cut the ropes and stayed together in the ship, all 276 souls found miraculous, beautiful redemption right amidst the floating wreckage. And honestly, that leaves us with an incredibly lingering, powerful question to think about. In the ultimate, uncontrollable, terrifying storms of your own life, whose voice are you going to anchor to? When the sky above you suddenly goes pitch black and the ship you've built starts splintering beneath your feet, Will you blindly continue to follow the comfortable, convenient illusions of worldly experts? Or will you boldly ground yourself in the hard, unyielding truth of spiritual conviction? It's a profound choice, and it's a choice that just might determine whether you sink into the dark or whether you survive the shipwreck and make it to the shore. Thank you so much for exploring this epic narrative with me today. I really hope it leaves you as breathless as it leaves me, and I sincerely hope you join us next time to uncover even more fascinating truths together. Until then, stay anchored.